the Oasis Court gathered under golden arches that had not seen rain in 3 generations and had never needed to. The sacred palace fountain stood at the center of the hall, empty, cracked along one side, the way clay cracks when it has been asked to hold something it no longer has. Amara stood before it. She was 25 years old, dressed in the pale blue that marked her as Luna. Though she had noticed over 5 years that the nobles never quite looked at her the way they looked at women born to their own water houses. She had been born in the low oasis, the cluster of clay homes and shallow wells 2 days' ride from the palace, where children learned to measure water in cupped hands before they learned to walk. The nobles called her Oasis-born. Low water, well witch. They said it quietly in corridors, in the specific tone people use when they want cruelty to remain deniable. Lord Kadir stood at the head of the council table. He had the bearing of a man who owned more water than he had ever publicly admitted to owning. He presented cracked water stones as evidence. He said, the sacred palace wells had begun failing 3 weeks ago. He said the failure coincided precisely with reports of unauthorized water movement traced to the low oasis district. He said only one person in the kingdom carried a water blessing, capable of moving that much water unnoticed. He looked at Amara. Lady Samira stood beside her father's banner, silent, her expression carefully arranged into something between concern and obligation. Sahir sat on the throne. He was 25, the same age as Amara, and he had the specific exhaustion of a king who had spent 3 weeks listening to council reports about wells he could not personally verify, and growing more frightened with each one. He asked her directly. He said, "Did you take water from the palace wells?" Amara looked at him. She thought about the 5 years she had spent learning which wells in the kingdom were dying quietly while the court counted gold rather than thirst. She said, "I gave water back to places your court forgot existed." It was true. It was also, she understood immediately, the kind of true that Kadir could turn into a confession if no one in the room was inclined to hear it any other way. Kadir said exactly that. He said she had admitted to redirecting sacred water. He said this was theft regardless of her intention. He said the kingdom could not survive a Luna who decided unilaterally where water belonged. Sahir looked at her. She watched something close behind his eyes, not disbelief in her exactly, but the specific surrender of a man who has decided that managing the fear in the room matters more than defending the person he loves inside it. He said the words the council had prepared for him. He cast her out. Until the water returned, she would no longer hold the title of Luna. She would no longer have standing within the palace. She would no longer be protected by the crown. Amara did not beg. She walked to the empty fountain. She placed her palm against the cracked clay basin. She said loud enough for the hall to hear, "You are not losing water. You are losing mercy." Then she turned and walked out of the Oasis Court, and no one stopped her, because stopping her would have required someone in that room to admit they did not actually believe what they had just voted for. That night, every well in the kingdom dried. It did not happen gradually. It happened the way a held breath releases, all at once, with a kind of finality that left no room for explanation through ordinary means. The palace fountains went silent first. Then the military cisterns drained in the space of an hour, their guards staring into empty stone basins that had supplied entire garrisons for a generation. Then the noble waterhouses, where deep wells that had run for 200 years without interruption simply stopped. Then the hidden garden springs that only the wealthiest families knew existed, the ones kept secret, precisely because they never failed. They failed. Servants in the palace kitchens watched water spirits rise from the fountain basin in trails of pale blue light, moving across the courtyard floor and out through the gates, following a path that led unmistakably toward the low oasis road, toward Amara. Sahir stood at the edge of the empty royal fountain at midnight and listened for the underground river that had always run beneath the palace. The one his grandfather had built the entire dynasty's water security around. He heard nothing. His wolf, usually a steady presence at the back of his mind, said something he did not want to hear. You cast out the river. Kadir arrived within the hour, already constructing the explanation that would let him avoid responsibility. He said Amara had cursed the kingdom from exile. He said this proved she had always controlled more water than the court understood, which proved the wisdom of removing her. Sahir looked at the empty fountain and did not entirely believe him, though he could not yet say why. Amara walked into the desert with nothing but the clothes she had been wearing in court, and the specific clarity that comes after a humiliation has finished happening, and there is nothing left to brace against. She did not know where she was walking. She only knew the palace was behind her, and that was for the moment enough of a direction. By midday, a group found her, exiled mothers who had been pushed out of low oasis villages when water taxes became unpayable. Caravan children separated from trade routes that no longer ran through districts too poor to bribe the water priests. One child, perhaps 6 years old, carried an empty clay cup and looked at Amara with the specific patience of someone who has learned not to expect things and is trying not to hope anyway. Amara knelt. She pressed her palm against the sand. She did not perform anything dramatic. She simply asked, the way she had been asking for years in secret, for what was already there to come up and be shared. A small spring opened beneath her hand. Not large, not enough for a kingdom. Enough for the children standing in front of her, and the mothers behind them, and the caravan elders who had not had a full cup in 3 days they drank. Amara watched them drink, and felt something in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but close to both. The specific feeling of doing the only thing you know how to do, while the larger problem remains entirely unsolved. Far beneath the noble quarter of the capital, in a chamber few people had ever seen, Lord Kadir's private reservoir glowed faintly blue and remained completely, defiantly full. He stood at its edge and watched the water that the rest of the kingdom believed had vanished entirely. He said, to no one in particular, in the satisfied tone of a man watching a plan proceed exactly as designed, "Let the palace thirst. Fear will bring the king to heel." Amara led the gathering exiles east, beyond the maps the palace scribes maintained, to an old moon oasis that the low oasis elders had spoken of in stories, but few had actually visited. It was real. Date palms grew in a ring around a central spring that had clearly been flowing, undisturbed, for longer than the current dynasty had existed. Amara stood at its edge for a long moment before she did anything else. She thought about the 5 years she had spent learning the desert's other geography, the one the palace maps never recorded, the underground rivers and forgotten springs and quietly dying village wells that no noble house had ever bothered to assess because assessing them would have meant admitting they mattered. She had healed cracked wells at night, traveling unescorted because an escort would have drawn attention. She had pressed palace water tokens into the hands of servant children who were not technically permitted to receive them. She had purified caravan cisterns during the sand plague 2 years ago, working through the night, while the court physicians declared the situation unsalvageable. She had stopped a company of soldiers from draining the last cistern in a low oasis village during a supply requisition, standing in front of the well with nothing but her title and her refusal to move. She had hidden exiled mothers near old springs the council did not know existed. She had listened to water spirits the nobles called superstition, because listening costs nothing and the spirits had never once lied to her about where the kingdom's water actually was. None of this had ever been recorded as service. The court had called it disobedience when it noticed at all. The people she had helped called it survival. Now, standing at the edge of a spring that belonged to no one and therefore could belong to everyone, she understood she was finally doing in the open what she had only ever been allowed to do in secret. She named it the Oasis of the Unclaimed. She set one rule, the only rule that mattered. No one would be denied water here by rank, by birth, by debt, or by the judgment of any court. Within 3 days, word reached every village within walking distance. Rogues who had been exiled for minor infractions arrived first, cautious, expecting to be turned away. Servants who had fled the palace after watching children go thirsty in the kitchens arrived next. Wounded guards, caravan families, low oasis wolves who had spent years paying water tax to noble houses that had never once needed the money. They all came. Elder Nima, leader of the largest caravan pack in the southern routes, arrived on the 4th day and looked at the spring with the particular scrutiny of someone who has spent a lifetime evaluating water sources for survival. She said, "This is not new water. This is old water, finally allowed to be shared." She sat with Amara that evening and explained something Amara had suspected but never had confirmed. The water blessing did not create water from nothing. It called water toward justice. That was why the palace fountains had flowed steadily for 5 years, while Amara secretly healed the low oasis wells at night. Because justice, however quietly maintained, had still been present in the kingdom. When Sahir cast her out, justice left the palace with her. The water had simply followed. "The palace measured water in gold," Nima said. "You measured it in children who lived." Amara held that sentence for a long time. She had never thought to put it in those terms, but she recognized it immediately as true. She also understood, for the first time with full clarity, the price of having kept all of this secret. If she had spoken openly years ago about the noble hoarding, about the drained low oasis cisterns, about the wells she healed quietly because speaking would have meant war between noble houses and the crown, perhaps this exile would never have happened. But perhaps speaking would have gotten her killed instead, and the wells would have died with her silence rather than survived through it. She did not know which choice would have been right. She only knew that secrecy could not continue to be the answer, now that the cost of it had become visible to an entire kingdom. Sahir spent the week after the exile doing something he had not done in 3 years of marriage to Amara. He read the actual water records himself, rather than the summaries the council prepared for him. What he found did not match what Kadir had presented in court. The low oasis wells had been drained repeatedly to fill noble war store reservoirs in the years leading up to the drought. Caravan taxes had doubled in the 18 months before the palace wells failed, with the additional revenue routed directly to Kadir's house treasury. The sacred waterstones Kadir had presented as evidence showed signs of deliberate tampering, not natural failure. 3 separate reports from Amara, filed formally over the past 2 years, warning that noble hoarding would eventually collapse the kingdom's water security, had been received and filed without response. Kadir's house had sealed an underground lake the same season the palace fountains began their slow decline. Sahir sat with these documents for most of a night. He began, for the first time, to doubt the trial he had presided over. He rode to the oasis of the unclaimed 3 days later. He brought guards, because a king traveling the desert without escort seemed, to him, like an unacceptable risk. He did not yet understand how that decision would be read. The Mercy Well, the small spring Amara had opened for the exiles, slowed to a trickle the moment the royal guards crossed within 100 yards of the oasis boundary. Amara watched this happen and said, without surprise, "Even water knows when men arrive to take." Sahir told the guards to wait at the tree line. He approached alone on foot, leaving his mount with them as well, which felt at the time like a small gesture and would later seem, in hindsight, like the first correct decision he had made in weeks. He asked for her help. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You do not want help. You want the wells to forgive you before the people do." He had no answer to that because it was accurate, and accuracy was the one thing he had not prepared a response for. Tariq, a boy of perhaps 12 who had worked in the palace kitchens since he was 8, collapsed at the edge of the oasis 3 days after Sahir's first visit. He had walked nearly 40 miles. His lips were cracked, and his hands shook when Amara lifted his head to give him water. When he could speak, he said, the palace had stopped allowing servants to draw from the royal fountains after Amara's exile, on the grounds that water needed to be conserved for noble households and military readiness. Servants had been drinking from a single shared barrel, rationed by a steward who answered to Kadir's office. 2 younger kitchen children had already been sent away when they grew too weak to work. Sahir, who had ridden out that same day to check on the oasis again, heard this directly. He stood very still. He had not known. He understood, in the specific way that understanding arrives too late to undo anything, that his own palace had been protecting noble comfort before children's survival, and that he had been too occupied with managing council fear to notice. That night, Amara showed him something she had been keeping for 2 years, in case the truth ever needed proving beyond her own word. A small bowl of water drawn secretly from beneath Kadir's estate by a servant loyal to the low oasis. Under moonlight, the water glowed faintly with a pattern of interlocking seals. Bloodline marks, hoarding marks, the kind of seal that bound water to a single family's ownership rather than allowing it to flow as the desert intended. Sahir looked at the glowing water for a long time. He said, "The noble houses did not lose water." Amara said, "No, they hid it." He understood finally the shape of what he had done. He had not cast out a thief. He had cast out the only Luna who had been keeping mercy alive in a kingdom built to forget it existed. Kadir moved against the sanctuary as soon as he understood Sahir's doubt was becoming dangerous. He declared, the oasis of the unclaimed and illegal rebel settlement. He argued that any water flowing there must have been diverted from royal sources, regardless of evidence to the contrary. He petitioned the council to authorize seizure. Lady Samira, meanwhile, had gone home. She found her family's underground lake exactly where it had always been, full, undisturbed, glittering in lantern light while reports from the capital described children in the lower city licking dew from stones at dawn. She stood at the edge of her father's reservoir for a long time. She had been raised to believe noble water stewardship prevented chaos. She had not been raised to reconcile that belief with the specific image of a child drinking dew because her family's lake was full and silent 2 miles away. She did not say anything to her father yet, but she began quietly gathering records of her own. Sahir came to Amara again, this time without guards, without the royal procession, without anything that marked him as king. He said he was wrong. He said it plainly, without the political phrasing the council had been feeding him for weeks. Amara looked at him. She said, "You were wrong before the kingdom. You do not get to be right beside one well where only I can hear it." He absorbed that. He left without arguing. Kadir's men reached the Mercy Well 3 nights later. They came in darkness, carrying sacks of salt ash, the substance used historically to poison wells beyond recovery during siege warfare. A sentry from the oasis spotted them before they reached the water, but not before they had already begun pouring the ash into the spring. Amara reached the well as the water began to turn bitter and gray. She did not call for help. She knelt at the edge and placed both hands directly into the contaminated water, drawing the curse into herself the way she had drawn drought sickness out of cracked village wells for years, except this time the poison was deliberate and concentrated and meant to destroy rather than merely fail. Her palms cracked along old scar lines, silver blue light spreading beneath her skin like the drought patterns she had spent years healing in. Others. The water cleared. The well kept flowing. Sahir arrived in time to see her hands, raw and marked, shaking slightly as she withdrew them from the basin. He had not known until that moment the specific physical cost of what she had been doing in secret for years. He looked at her hands and understood that her mercy had never been free. It had simply never been visible to anyone who benefited from not looking. Elder Nima spent the following days compiling caravan ledgers, water tax receipts, and testimony from families who had paid exorbitant crossing fees at noble-controlled springs while children died of thirst, less than a day's walk from full reservoirs. She prepared to bring this evidence to whatever court would hear it. A sandstorm rose over the desert that week, unusual for the season, and water spirits gathered visibly above the oasis of the unclaimed in numbers no one at the sanctuary had seen before. They did not return to the palace. They waited, the way water waits before a flood, gathering rather than dispersing. Word spread through the lower districts that the oasis had water, and the palace did not. People began walking, not in rebellion, not with weapons, simply with empty jars and the specific desperation of thirst that no longer cared about royal boundaries. Kadir called it an uprising. He sealed the roads to the oasis and ordered royal soldiers to seize the Mercy Well by force, framing it to the council as a national security necessity rather than what it actually was, which was an attempt to prevent his own exposure. Sahir received the order for his seal before it could be executed. He stood with the document in his hand and understood that he had run out of room to manage both sides of this. He would have to choose between the law that had protected his nobles for generations and the Luna he had exiled for trying to live outside it. Sahir ordered the Oasis Court reopened, not in the palace, but at the edge of Amara's sanctuary, under open sky, where the people gathering with their empty jars could witness whatever was decided. The nobles were furious. They came anyway, because refusing to appear would have looked like guilt, and most of them had not yet calculated how much guilt they were prepared to display. The crowd that gathered was larger than the original Oasis Court had ever held. Caravan families, servants who had walked from the palace, low Oasis villagers who had not been permitted inside the golden arches in living memory. Children with empty jars standing at the front, because Amara had insisted they be allowed to stand where they could see. Kadir stood and demanded Amara answer formally for the theft of sacred water. He spoke for some time, citing precedent, citing the original trial, citing the danger of allowing a single Luna to redirect the kingdom's most essential resource according to her own judgment. He was, Amara noted, very good at sounding reasonable while describing an injustice. Amara said, "No." The single word carried further than she expected across the open sand. Today the wells answer who stole from whom. She knelt and poured a vessel of moonlit water onto the ground between the assembled nobles and the gathered crowd. The water spread, found channels beneath the sand that should not have existed in dry earth, and began to glow, tracing, in lines of pale blue light, the locations of every hidden noble reservoir within a day's ride. The crowd gasped. Several noble representatives stepped back from the light as if it could identify them personally, which, in a sense, it was about to. One line of light traced directly beneath the feet of a noble lord who had spent the morning loudly supporting Kadir's position. He stopped speaking. Evidence followed quickly. Bloodline seals matching the marks Amara had shown Sahir privately, now visible to everyone present. Ledgers Nima had gathered over weeks of careful documentation, showing water taxes that bore no relationship to actual scarcity, collected from families who had been told the kingdom faced drought while noble reservoirs sat full. The poisoned residue from the salt ash attack traced directly to materials purchased through Kadir's household accounts by a steward who, when questioned, did not deny the purchase. Amara's own ignored warnings, filed and dated over the past 2 years, read aloud by a court scribe who had clearly never expected to read them publicly and stumbled slightly over the formal language of his own court's negligence. Servant ration orders issued after her exile, showing the deliberate restriction of palace water to non-noble staff during a period when royal reservoirs were not in fact empty. And finally, a private communication from Kadir to his household steward, instructing him to let the palace's fear of drought grow before offering any solution, so that the council's dependence on noble water houses would deepen and his own influence would expand accordingly. The crowd's reaction to this last document was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was the specific quiet of people recalculating exactly how much they had been deceived. Lady Samira stepped forward before anyone called on her. She had not been asked to testify. She had decided to anyway, somewhere between her father's reservoir and this moment, in the quiet hours when she had stopped being able to justify her silence to herself. She said her family's wells had been full the entire time Kadir claimed the kingdom faced drought, she said. The marriage alliance being prepared between her family and the crown had been intended to replace Amara with a Luna, whose family already controlled deep water. A Luna who would never threaten noble water ownership by giving it away. She looked at her father's allies in the crowd. "I was raised to believe this protected us from chaos," she said. "I did not understand that it was the chaos." The crowd's attention shifted entirely toward Kadir. He began constructing a final argument about ancient water charter rights belonging to founding noble houses, his voice losing some of its earlier composure. The Mercy Well, behind Amara, stopped flowing entirely. Sahir understood what that meant before anyone explained it to him. Command would not bring it back, law might. He walked to the well. He knelt in the sand before it, in front of nobles and caravan families and servants and the children who had walked days to reach this water, and he said, "I exiled the Luna, who kept my kingdom from thirst." He let that settle into the silence of several hundred people listening. "I called her blessing theft because I was afraid to see who actually owned the wells. I protected order while children were denied water 2 miles from full reservoirs." He looked at the dry basin. "I will not ask the wells to return until water belongs to life before it belongs to rank." The Mercy Well began to glow, faint at first, then stronger. Amara walked to the well and placed her cracked hands into the water. She did not command it. She asked it the way she always asked to witness what was happening. Water spirits rose from the spring, shapes like wolves made of rain and pale glass, moving with a fluid grace that belonged to something older than the kingdom's laws. They moved out across the desert in every direction, and everywhere they passed, the ground lit briefly with the location of water that had been hidden, sealed, or claimed against the desert's older agreement that water belonged to whoever needed it to live. Kadir tried one final argument, invoking the ancient water charter that had granted founding houses control over discovered wells. Sahir took the charter from the council archivist's hands and tore it in half in front of the assembled court. He said the charter had outlived whatever justice it once claimed to serve. Kadir was arrested for hoarding sacred water, poisoning a sanctuary well, and manufacturing a drought crisis to consolidate noble power. He did not resist. There was nowhere left to direct the argument. Water returned to the kingdom in an order no one had designed, but everyone understood the moment they saw it. The servant wells in the palace kitchens filled first. Then the caravan basins along the southern trade routes. Then the orphan shelters in the lower city, where children had been rationing dew for 2 weeks. Then the camp where exiled mothers had been surviving on what little Amara could spare. Then the low oasis villages, whose wells had been the first to fail and the last to be acknowledged. Only after every one of these had filled completely did the royal palace fountain begin to flow again, slow at first, then steady. Water rising through cracked clay that had been empty for what felt like a season, but had only been weeks. The order was the point. No one needed it explained. The new water rights law took shape over the following month, drafted with input from people who had never before been permitted in a drafting room. No noble house could privately own a sacred well. Emergency water access belonged first to children, the sick, the elderly, healers, and travelers, in that order, regardless of rank. Low oasis villages could not be taxed beyond what was needed for shared maintenance. Caravans received free access to all mercy wells along recognized routes. Servants could draw from any fountain, palace, or otherwise. Exiled wolves retained full water rights regardless of their standing with the crown. Hoarding water during a declared drought was classified as treason. Sanctuary wells could never be seized by royal or noble authority. Every water priest panel was required to include at least one witness from the low oasis communities. Sahir asked Amara if she would return to the palace. She said, "I will not live again under fountains that learned mercy only after thirst forced them to." She remained at the oasis of the unclaimed. He asked what he could do instead. She said, "Carry water." He did, not as king. As a man finally doing the labor his laws had always assumed someone else would do invisibly. Weeks later, Sahir returned to the oasis with clay jars strapped across his back, the same kind the low oasis children carried, filled from the sanctuary spring for delivery to a settlement 2 miles distant that still lacked its own reliable well. The walk had clearly been difficult. His feet showed it. His shoulders showed it more. Children at the oasis laughed at the sight of a king bent under the weight of water jars, sweating in the same sun as everyone else, and he let them laugh, which Amara noted was new. The version of Sahir who had sat on the throne 3 months ago would have found a way to make the laughter feel like disrespect. This version simply adjusted his grip and kept walking. Amara watched him from the shade of the date palms. She did not run to him. She did not forgive him completely, not yet. And she had stopped expecting herself to arrive at forgiveness on any particular schedule. The way Mother Celine's counterparts in other sanctuaries had told her, grief worked when she had asked, early on, how long this part was supposed to last. There was no schedule. There was only the next true thing. She walked over and helped him adjust the strap that had been cutting into his shoulder. She did not say anything especially warm. She said, "You are carrying it wrong." She showed him the proper way to balance the weight across both shoulders rather than one. He adjusted, he said. "Better?" "Better," she said. She let him fill the remaining jars from her well. She watched him walk the 2 miles to the settlement that needed them, and she did not go with him, because this part was his to do without her standing over the work, checking whether he was doing it correctly. That was, for that day, enough. 1 year later, the Oasis of the Unclaimed held formal legal protection, the first sanctuary in the kingdom's history to be written into law as permanently outside noble or royal seizure. Amara led the new water council, made up of representatives from low oasis villages, caravan packs, palace servants, and reformed noble houses in equal number. The council met in the open, under the date palms, rather than behind golden arches, because Amara had insisted that any decision about water belonged in a place where the thirsty could watch it being made. Lady Samira spent her days exposing the last of her father's hidden reservoirs, working alongside water priests who had once served Kadir and now served the council instead. Her father did not speak to her for the first several months. She continued the work regardless. Elder Nima oversaw caravan water rights from a tent at the oasis edge, holding court with considerably less ceremony than the Oasis Court had ever managed and considerably more fairness. Tariq, recovered and steady, had become an apprentice waterkeeper, learning to read the desert's underground rivers the way Amara had taught him, his hands growing steadily more confident with each cracked well he helped heal. Sahir visited without royal procession, usually on foot, usually carrying something useful. He had stopped wearing the crown on these visits months ago. No one had asked him to. He had simply noticed, one day, that it made the children at the oasis quieter around him, and quiet was not what he wanted from them anymore. One afternoon, a noble guard, one of the few who had not yet adjusted to the new order, tried to stop a rogue mother from drawing water at a public well, citing her unclear pack status as grounds for refusal. Under the old law, he would have been correct. Sahir, present at the well that day, said nothing and stepped back, deferring the moment to the person whose judgment now carried more weight than his title. Amara looked at the guard. She asked, "Whose thirst outranks a child's?" The guard lowered his head. He stepped aside. The mother filled her jar, and her child drank, and no one in the gathered crowd needed to be told that this was what the new law had actually been written to protect. The desert Alpha King cast out his water-blessed Luna because he thought she had stolen the wells. But when every well dried overnight, the desert told the truth. Amara had not taken the kingdom's water. She had been the only reason mercy still flowed.